Hello, everyone. Just want to remind you that this session will be recorded. I'm still admitting students, so give me a second, then we'll start. Okay, hi. I hope you guys are doing well and ready for the weekend. Um, I was surprised that many of you did not submit assignment one. Now, was there any problem with assignment one? Were some of you not aware of the deadline? Did the Turnitin tool did not work well? Can you please let me know in the chat box if you didn't get a chance to submit assignment one, you're still interested in submitting assignment one, just let me know. If something went wrong or you were not aware of the deadline. And so maybe I can give an extension for those of you if you missed the deadline by accident or the link wasn't working, because you know I received almost just half of the class submitted and half the class did not submit assignment one, so that was surprising. So if something went wrong, just let me know. I think the deadline should be next week. Is the deadline next week? Really? Am I mistaken? Okay, so maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I put the wrong deadline. Let me check. If the deadline is next week, then that's fine. Is that what I published? Let me double check actually. So the good thing about doing things online is that I have access to my computer and I can check. And it might be my mistake because a lot of you didn't submit, so maybe I sense that I must have done something wrong. So the deadline says September 18th on the assignment document, but if somehow, oh, in Brightspace it says that? Okay. Okay. So it must be my fault. So I'm gonna push the deadline 1 week. Okay. So for everybody, if you didn't get a chance to submit it, I'm going to push the deadline until September 25th. For whatever reason, I had the wrong deadline on Brightspace somehow. So you have until September 25th. Okay, so I will honor whatever deadline is on Brightspace. So if you didn't get a chance to submit, you still can submit. And you don't submit on Brightspace, you submit on Turnitin, okay? So if you don't have a Turnitin account, let me know. I created a Turnitin account for everybody in class. You should have received an email from Turnitin so that you can set up your account. If you didn't receive that email, or if you believe you don't have a Turnitin account, just let me know and I'll figure it out, okay? So please make sure immediately after this lecture, double check that you have a Turnitin account. I saw that most of you logged in Turnitin, so most of you figured it out, but a couple of students did not log in to Turnitin yet. So if you're having trouble with Turnitin, let me know. Or if you were registered to the course, after last week's lecture, maybe you weren't added to the Turnitin course website, so I would add you manually. Just let me know if there are any problems. Okay. Any questions or issues before we start? No, if you submit it, great. Unless you want to improve on what you submitted, you can keep improving until September 25th. I just have to go to, don't submit anything now. I have to go to Turnitin. Just give me until tomorrow morning. I'm just going to go to Turnitin and adjust the deadline so it doesn't mark your submission as late. But if you already submitted, you're done. If you want to submit it again, improve it and submit it again, you can. You have unlimited submissions. But if you're done with it and you're happy with your copy, then great. Okay? Any other questions? I hope I didn't confuse everybody. Any other questions or concerns? And I also sent a link for team formation. Some of you already formed teams. Some of you just added your names to the list. You have until Sunday to add your name to the list. And then after Sunday, I'll assume if you did not add your name to the list of students that are looking for a team, then you found your own team. Okay, so you have until Sunday. If you don't know where the link to that list is, just go on Brightspace and you'll figure it out. There's a spreadsheet, there's a link to a spreadsheet where you can go and enter your information. And then I'll put you in a team. If you have a special request, let's say you are not the best programmer and you want to be teamed with people that are, have a better background than you in programming, just send me an email in addition to adding your name to the list. Any questions or concerns? Good. So today, as I mentioned last time, every lecture we flip a coin, and if it's if it's heads, then we have a quiz. If it's tails, we don't have a quiz. We're not going to do that today because we just didn't really cover enough material. I was trying to come up with a quiz and I was just not comfortable because we didn't cover enough material. So that would start next week. Also, I was thinking about the quizzes. The quizzes on the syllabus are worth 10%. And I honestly feel that's too much. I think we can reduce them to 5% and put the extra weight on the project. So unless somebody is opposed to that idea, you can let me in the chat box, no, in the chat box, or you can send me a private email letting me know, that doesn't work for you. If somebody is opposed to that, what is the maximum? So I have a question in the chat box. What is the maximum similarity percentage allowed? Okay. That's for Turnitin, right? As long as it's green, it's fine. So it's color coded. As long as it's green, it's fine. And also look at what it's catching. If it's catching something that something that cannot be changed, like I don't know, you have a mathematical equation and it's telling you that's similar to another paper. Well, that's fine. So also, try to keep it green and make sure that what it is catching is not really something that you can control. So, there are things that will be similar because that's just how it is. A math equation is an example. So sometimes it catches silly things, and that's not a big deal. So what I recommend is to look at the percentage, look at the color code on Turnitin. If it shows after scanning your copy, it's green, you're fine. But even sometimes when it's yellow, you're fine if it's catching some silly things that are not important. But if you don't want to risk it, just make sure it's green. Does that answer your question? Okay, no problem. So yes, so for the quizzes, if I'm gonna change the syllabus to put the weight of the quizzes to 5% and put the extra 5% on the project. If you object to that, you can let me know in the chat box or you can send me a private email. If anybody objects to it, then I won't do it. If nobody objects to it, then I will do it. Then the quizzes will be worth only 5% because I think 10% is just a bit too much, especially that the quizzes don't have a lot of questions. So if you get one wrong, that's really gonna, bring your mark down. So I wasn't comfortable with it. So if I don't hear any complaints, then I'll switch it to 5% for the quizzes. Great. Okay. So let's start then. We're gonna start a new topic today. Can we have both as bonus? You mean the extra 5 for both of them as well? so so basically you're talking about the quizzes, right? Um, yeah. So the extra 5% would be bonus. Yeah, that would not work out. No, that's a lot of bonus. Maybe 1% can be a bonus, but 5% bonus, that's that's a lot of bonus. But the quizzes are going to be open book. They're multiple choice. They're not too difficult. But I just felt that 10% was a bit too much. Where you make a small mistake, it's just unfair. If you make a small mistake, you lose a lot of marks. So that's why I want to make it into 5%. Okay, great. So let me share my screen. And again, just like last time, if you're comfortable opening your camera, that would be good. If you're not comfortable, that's fine too. At least I get feedback if you open it, but if you're not comfortable, that's okay too. Let me bring the chat box so I can see if you're chatting. Also, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or ask me the question in the chat box, whatever you're comfortable doing, okay? Everything works. Great, so the topic of this lecture is effect modalities. By the way, I'm using a new headset. Is the audio clear? I literally just unboxed it and I'm using it for this lecture, so it's clear. Great. Okay, so the topic of this lecture is effect modalities, and so we're going to see what effect modalities are and how we can fuse a variety of effect modalities to be able to gain a better understanding of the affective state of a human subject. So we're assuming that computers are interested in assessing the emotions of humans interacting with them, and we're going to see the various modalities of information that they can rely on to assess that information. So first, we're going to talk about effect models. Last time we talked about the nature of effects. Today we're going to start by talking about effect models. How do you categorize emotions? And then we're going to talk about effect modalities. These are the modalities of information that a computer can use that could be available at the disposal of a computer in order to recognize emotions. So we're going to look at the visual modality, the audio modality, and the physiological modality. We're going to look at effect fusion. How do you fuse information coming from different modalities? Just think about it. When you're interacting with somebody, and you're basically, even without putting any effort, you're sensing their emotional status. If they're disgruntled, or if they're stressed, or if they're nervous, you're kind of getting clues about their emotional states through their emotional expression. Now, you're not looking at a particular modality. You're looking at the facial expression. You're looking at the posture, the gestures. You're looking at their speech tone. You're hearing what they're saying, and you're combining all these pieces of information to make a conclusion about their emotional state as is expressed by these modalities. So that's what we want computers to do. We want them to gather all the possible information that they can gather so they can make an assessment. And so the idea here of effect fusion is, how do we combine, how do we fuse all these pieces of information so that we can make an assessment? And finally, we're going to talk about effective computing data sets. These are the data sets that we use to train AI models so that they can recognize emotions. So we'll start with effect models. So last time, we talked about the nature of emotions, whether it's physiological or cognitive. We talked about the James Lange theory, the Cannon-Barth theory. But how do we classify emotions? So there are two general models. The first one is the discrete emotions model. So it contends that emotions are discrete. Example of discrete emotions: happiness, sadness, fear. So these are distinct categories of emotions. And that implies that human beings experience a set of basic and distinct emotions. So I have a question here. Please, how about you mark each quiz out of 10 and find the average, or select the best one? Select the best one out of all of them. The best one out of all of them. Then that guarantees that everybody gets the 5%, because you're going to ace one of them. We'll talk about that at the end of the lecture. I'll think about it. That will give me time to think about it. Thank you for the question. Okay, so it implies that emotions are discrete and distinct, and there are basic emotions. Just think about it in terms of, it's analogous to primary colors, right? You have primary colors, distinct primary colors. And so in this case, we have distinct, basic, discrete emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, and so forth. So that's one way to think about emotions. The other way to think about emotions is to think of emotions as dimensions, as expressed by dimensional components. So this is the dimensional emotion model. So example of dimensional models are models that contain a variety of dimensions that express valence and arousal. And I'm going to explain these in detail in a second. But the idea is that you have various components that contribute to an overall emotion, but emotions are not as distinct as, let's say, happiness, sadness, or fear. We tend to attach labels to particular dimensional spaces. So I'll talk about that in a second. But let's start with the easy one, discrete emotion theory. So discrete emotion theory contends that we have basic emotions. According to Paul Ekman, I don't know if you remember Paul Ekman, that's the psychologist that worked extensively on facial expressions. We talked about him last lecture. He worked on the universality of facial expressions. He worked on the facts, the taxonomy of facial expressions. And also he contends that there are 6 basic emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise, okay? So you'll see a lot of data sets and a lot of papers in effective computing using these 6 basic emotions. And so this is a classic model for emotions. These are well-recognized 6 emotions, 6 basic emotions. And they're well-recognized for a variety of reasons. One of them is that Paul Ekman is quite an influential psychologist. So also that helped, push this theory forward. But not everybody agrees that there are only 6 basic emotions. So a variety of research papers will describe a different number of basic emotions. For instance, if you look at Izzard et al., and I have a reference here, they propose 12 emotional classes as opposed to 6. And you find other research works that propose a variety of different basic emotions. So the number of basic emotions and the basic emotions are not really well agreed upon in the community. So that's really one of the problems with discrete emotion theory, is that we really don't know how many basic emotions. So the discrete emotion theory says that we have basic emotions that are distinct, but we cannot agree on what are these basic emotions, because different works propose different basic emotions. So the theory of discrete emotions supposes that we have independent neural structures that are responsible for processing different emotions. So we have neural structures that are responsible for the different distinct discrete emotions. However, how do they account for the words that we have in a variety of languages, not just English, but in English, that are not, let's say, part of this small set: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise? Most people would agree that distress or contempt or shame are emotions. So how do we account for these, labels that are not part of this basic small set of, let's say, 6 basic emotions? Well, researchers in this area say these are simply synonyms of the predefined categories. They might express a predefined category, maybe at a different intensity level, but they don't introduce a new emotion. They are referring to existing emotions, just using a different word that might express maybe the intensity of the emotion. So the stress, for instance, would correspond to maybe sadness, but a different intensity of sadness. So distinct emotions may have evolved to facilitate interpersonal communication. And that's really what discrete theory emotion pushes, that they evolved. We have distinct emotions and they have evolved to facilitate interpersonal communication. Just think about it, if we experience emotions that allow us to process our interactions with other human beings, and also we display clues about these emotions, then that might lead to a more effective communication where we don't cause each other distress, we don't disadvantage each other, we don't take advantage of each other, at least ideally in an ideal society. So it may lead to better societal harmony. Now let's jump to dimensional emotion theory, which is what to me makes more sense, but I'm not a psychologist, but this is what makes more sense to me. And this is what I use typically in my research. So in this case, we describe emotions as a combination of dimensions. The most a simplistic model would use two dimensions, valence and arousal. So valence expresses the range of negative to positive emotions, and arousal expresses the range of no excitement whatsoever to, very high excitement. Okay, so let's say you are angry. That's a negative emotion, but that also involves, excitement, right? So it involves high arousal. So in this case, maybe anger would be, oops, let me just fixing the pen. So if you are somewhere in this region, we would attach the label of anger, but the label of anger is nothing but just an expression of the amount of valence and arousal you're experiencing. So if you have this amount of negative valence and this amount of positive arousal, you're somewhere in this region of this space, and that would be labeled as anger. So we use this language to label different regions in this dimensional model. However, if you are experiencing a negative valence and a negative arousal, so maybe here you are kind of depressed, right? And so forth. So different regions in this space reflect different emotions, and we just attach label to these regions. But emotions by nature are dimensional and they're not discrete. But again, for dimensional emotions, there isn't an agreed upon model, and there are numerous models that exist. I'm just going to mention two of them, okay, because there are so many. First one is the circumplex model. The circumplex model only uses two dimensions, the range of pleasant to unpleasant, which is valence, and the range of deactivation to activation, which is arousal. And it defines a variety of emotions in that space along a circle. For instance, if you're contented, that's a pleasant emotion, and you're not probably very activated. If you're happy, on the other hand, you're a bit more activated, and so forth. So it kind of defines these labels around this area of two-dimensional representation of emotions. Any questions so far? Now, the PAD model is one of the most popular models. And if you work in the area of effective computing, at some point you're going to stumble upon the PAD model, because PAD model uses three dimensions, so it's a bit richer. However, the name of the third dimension is a bit unfortunate because it doesn't really express what it is. So obviously we have the pleasantness, which reflects valence. You have the arousal, just like the circumplex model. But you also have a third dimension, which is dominance. And so that tends to confuse a lot of study subjects when we try to tell them about this model. If we're doing study in the lab, the third dimension is always confusing. everybody understands what's pleasantness, the range of not pleasant at all, an emotion that is not pleasant at all to an emotion that is pleasant. That's valence. Arousal, how excited the person is. That's also understood. So what is dominance? Dominance refers to how in control do you feel, how confident do you feel. Okay, so if you're scared, you don't really feel quite in control, so you would be low on dominance. Okay, so that's what dominance refers to.
Professor,
Yes,
I have a question about the dimensions. Did
yes,
you mention that there are other theories for
yes,
different dimensions as well? And I'm just curious what would be an example of another.
yes. So they use pretty much more or less the same dimensions. It's just that they organize the emotions a bit differently. Um, yeah, but pretty much most of the models use either 2 or 3 dimensions. It's just that the organization of the emotions tends to be a bit different from one model to the other. But the dimensions are kind of almost agreed upon. I and most of them will at least have valence and arousal.
I see. So, okay, so the arousal valence would stay the same, but then they wouldn't know where to put relaxed, for example, is that what changes? They wouldn't know where to put the emotions along the axes?
So if you don't want to use, let's say, the third dimension, dominance. Uh, oh, so you're saying they had nowhere to put relax, or they put relax in a different place?
Or I'm trying to understand what the
Actually,
disagreements are.
okay. Actually, what I can do is I can show you one of these models since I have a computer, and maybe we can talk about that model. So here's a model that is quite. Let me see how I can open this. This is an interesting model. It's quite distinct from the others. Um, I haven't
I
seen.
still only
Yeah,
see your slide. Sorry.
you see
Oh,
it now.
yeah, I see it.
So I'm just admitting some students. So this one is quite distinct from the others, and you see it goes along many dimensions, and so you have the dimension. This dimension goes from ecstasy to joy to serenity. This dimension, admiration, trust, acceptance, and you can have something in between that reflects, let's say, love. So this model is used mostly in psychology. You will never see anybody in effective computing using that, but because it's just too complex to teach a model, an AI model to learn that. Let me see if I have other models. So that's a famous model as well. Yeah, I can share on Brightspace also some references to other models, but these tend to be by far um, the the most popular models, and in particular the PAD model and the 6 basic emotions is what we encounter vast majority of the time in effective computing. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
My pleasure. Okay, so um, the self-assessment mannequin. If you work in effective computing, at some point you're going to encounter the self-assessment mannequin, or what's called a SAM. SAM is inspired by the PAD model, and it basically is an easy way, or honestly I don't find it that easy, but it's a visual way to allow subjects to assess their emotions using a dimensional models. So what you would do is basically you would ask subjects to rate their emotions after, let's say, you bring subjects to the lab, let's say, and you show them an emotionally charged multimedia content. Okay, and you're trying to evoke certain emotions, and you want to make sure you evoke the right emotions, or you want to just see what kind of emotions were evoked. So you would give them this form. It's called the SAM form, and you would ask them, okay, fill that form, and the first row reflects valence. So I don't know if you can see it properly, but it's showing this um, figure here going from happy to very unhappy. And in the second row is showing arousal, going from explosively excited to not excited at all. And the third one, dominance, and it shows, you know, if the figure is big, and that means you feel in control. If the figure is small, you feel like you're not in control. And so this is widely used. I honestly don't like that form, but if you look at the affective computing literature, you're going to stumble upon that form. So I thought I'd introduce it. In my research, I'd rather ask, because to me it doesn't look extremely intuitive. What we end up doing is telling the subjects exactly what they mean so that they can use the form. Then what's the point? Maybe we can just tell them textually what we want them to tell us. But this is basically the self-assessment mannequin that is typically associated with the dimension with the PAD model. Um, Whenever you're conducting experiments and you want to check the emotions of subjects, you would give them at the end of the experiment the SAM form to fill. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about affect estimation. So how do computers recognize or assess emotions? Well, there's a general process, and I'm going to explain that general process. But again, I'm going to explain it from a high level point of view, and then we're going to dive a little bit more deeply as we go through this section of affective computing. So the first step is obtain some raw signals using sensors. And you can use a variety of sensors, wearable sensors, visual sensors, auditory sensors, whatever sensor that you have at your disposal to extract information, to obtain information. So you obtain some raw signals that you're going to use for the assessment of emotions. Second step, you're going to pre-process these raw signals. Do some filtration, eliminate artifacts, um, denoise, do whatever is necessary to make sure you've conserved the important information and you got rid of unimportant information that might render your estimation of emotion less accurate. For instance, if you want to assess emotions from facial expressions, well, maybe just get a bounding box around the face, get rid of the background, get rid of all extra information in the image because you don't need that. So that's a pre-processing step. Next step is extracting features. Something in the chat. So next step is the feature extraction. So what's feature extraction? Typically, when we want to use an AI model to estimate something, one of the things we do before we feed data to the model, we extract features. So does anybody want to tell me, if you have done any machine learning, what a feature is and why do we extract these features? Anybody has done machine learning here that wants to take a stab at it? So we got the raw signals. No, I'm talking about features and not labels. So labels is something else we're going to talk about, but what are features?
Isn't it the same as the input that we give to the model?
Yes. Now, the question is, why don't we feed directly the raw signals that are pre-processed? So we obtained some raw signals. We obtained some raw signals initially. So let Sorry about that. So we got some raw signals from sensors. We pre-processed them, so we cleaned them up. Why don't we feed that directly to an AI model so that we can estimate emotions? Why do we have to extract features? Here's why. Well, these features we know are relevant to the solution of the problem at hand. Typically, when you have this pre-processed raw signal, it contains some useful information and some information that is not quite useful. If you don't just try to eliminate some of the not so useful information and keep the most useful information, your machine learning algorithm will struggle for reasons I'll explain later. And so you don't want to feed the raw signals to your machine learning algorithm. What you do, you use a variety of techniques to extract features. We're going to talk about these techniques. Once you extract features, these features are supposedly quite reflective of the emotional state. They carry emotional affective information. So you're going to extract these features, and then you're going to feed these features as input to an AI model so that the AI model would estimate emotions. Now, I'm going to go over this process in more details, but I'm just giving you the overview. Do we need features for deep learning? Yes, we do, but the process is a bit different. Absolutely, we do. It's just that I'll get to that. Yes, you always need features. You always use features, whether it's deep learning or conventional machine learning, you always need features. But there's a difference between deep learning, we're using convolutional neural networks, and conventional machine learning. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. So we're going to talk about the some effect modalities. I'll start with the visual modality, then audio, then physiological. We'll go over all of these. And as we go over all of these, we're going to go over the process of estimating emotions. So I'll start with the visual modality because the visual modality is by far the most popular one, especially facial expressions. You know, anybody that wants to start working effective computing will start looking at facial expressions. It's intuitive, and the facial expressions are very rich in effective information. In fact, for your assignment 3, that's exactly what you're going to do. I'm going to give you a data set of images of facial expressions, and you're basically going to classify emotions. So you're going to build your own AI model to classify emotions. So we're going to look at facial expressions. We're going to look at body expressions. But there are other pieces of information in the visual modality, like eye gaze. Basically, you track the eye movement to infer information about the affective state while the subject is exposed to a certain stimulus, such as maybe looking at a video or looking at a picture. You monitor how their pupils are moving, how they're moving their eyes to. So you track their eyes, and that gives you information about their emotional state. Or pupil diameter. The pupil diameter increases as you get more excited. So the diameter of the pupil is associated with arousal. And blink rate, if it increases, is associated with fear. There's a recent study in I think 2019. They looked at blink rate as it changes in response to different emotions, and they were able to show quite clearly it's associated with fear. So you start blinking faster when you're scared. Well, we're going to focus on facial expression and body expression. So we'll start with facial expression. I know we talked about facial expression, but we're going to take it beyond that, what we just introduced in the first lecture. So for facial expression detection involves 3 steps, okay? First step, face detection. Obviously, you cannot detect facial expressions if you don't know what the face is. So you want to detect the face. And if you are using a video, you want to track the face. You don't want to detect the face every frame. because it's just computationally expensive. It's easier to detect the face in one frame and then use a tracking algorithm. Tracking algorithms tend to be less computationally expensive. So tracking algorithms basically tell them, okay, I would like to track these sets of pixels, and it just tracks them from one frame to another and tells you where they are. And so that tends to be less expensive than detecting the face every single time. Then you do feature extraction, and then you do effect classification or estimation. So these are the 3 steps. Let's explore these 3 steps, starting with face detection. Now, we're not going to focus a lot on face detection. There are many algorithms that focus on face detection, and it's still an open area of research. You still get a lot of research papers every year on face detection, automatic face detection. So because there are still challenges. You'd think that's a settled research question, but it's not. There are still a lot of challenges associated with lighting conditions. If the lighting is a bit dim, or if there are lots of shadows, it affects the accuracy of the algorithm. Wearable artifacts tend to affect the accuracy of the algorithm, especially nowadays with masks. If you didn't train your model to detect a face when they're wearing a mask, then that's a problem. Also, head pose angle is actually a major problem that I found in my research. Surprisingly, most state-of-the-art algorithms, if you just turn your head 30 to 45 degrees, they no longer detect that there's a face anymore. And so there are challenges that still need to be solved. One of the most popular face detection algorithms, this is really the algorithm that everybody starts with. And if that works for you, you stay with that algorithm. If not, then you try other algorithms. The most popular one is called Viola-Jones. This is what everybody will start with. So the Viola-Jones algorithm has been around for a while, and it's quite robust. It works quite well. It doesn't work very well if you turn your head a little bit. It doesn't deal very well with head poses that are not perfectly looking at the camera. But otherwise, it works quite well. And one of the reasons why it's so popular is because it's been around for a while, it's robust, and there are many open source implementations of the Viola-Jones. One of them is integrated in an image processing library called OpenCV library. OpenCV library for any image processing developer is absolutely a key library because it includes lots of popular algorithms so that you don't have to implement them yourself. They're already implemented for you. It's an open source library. You download it, you use it in your program. And it also has support for mobile devices. Let's say you want to develop on Android, you can deploy OpenCV on Android and use its algorithm. So it's quite popular. So Viola-Jones is supported in OpenCV library, and most of the time, this is what you start with. You start with Viola-Jones to detect the face. And if you're doing research, you're not developing a full-blown system. You just want to focus on the part where you estimate emotions. Just that's the part you want to contribute on. You're not developing an entire system. Well, you might avoid the face detection step by using one of the data sets where they already detected the face for you. So there are many publicly available data sets where they already give you pictures where the face has already been detected. So you don't really have to go through the face detection step. But that only works for research and for course assignments. But if you are developing a full-blown system, you have to detect the face, and then you have to extract features, and then you have to assess emotions. Okay, feature extraction from the face. In general, there exist 2 types of facial features: geometric features and appearance features. So geometric features are any features that correspond to face geometry. We're trying to fit some points on the face, and we're looking at the position of these points relative to each other. Or if we are processing a video, we're looking how fast these points are moving and in what direction. So we look at velocity vectors. Okay, I'll go into more details about the geometric features in a second. The other type of features, and the more popular one, is called appearance features. This is where you can use deep learning. So with appearance features, we typically apply an image filter to the face. And so the idea here is that we know the facial image has a lot of information that is not that useful. It has some information that is useful, but it has a lot of information that is not useful for facial expression assessment. So the point of filtering is to try to eliminate the not so useful information and to emphasize the useful information. So useful information for facial expression comes in the form of facial bulges and creases and shadows and edges. These are the pieces of information that we want. However, if you take a look, let's say, at this image on the top here, just take a look at the forehead. There are no creases. I don't know why it's not selecting the pen. You see, there are no creases here. There's not a lot of information. There are no shadows. There's not much going on here, right? This whole area is not that useful. Maybe also if you look at this area here, it's not giving me a lot of information. However, this area where I have this major edge and shadows and all sorts of useful information, that area is rich in information. It's giving me information about, the facial muscle movements. So that's something that I would want to emphasize. So here's the question. Usually need both of them or just one of them? In terms of the features, good questions. So do we need geometric features or appearance features or both of them? It depends on your implementation. So some systems, they'll use only geometric features. Geometric features were extremely popular, even 5-10 years ago. Most of the research work relied on geometric features. And since sometimes commercial products are a bit behind the latest trends in research, you'll see that most of the commercial products that make use of some sort of a facial expression assessment system, they use geometric features. Appearance features became more popular recently because deep learning also makes use of appearance features. And also you have a lot of research work that uses both of them, and they found that both of them work better than one. So there's no agreement on what way is the best way. It really depends on the context of your application. But a lot of recent research shows that if you use both of them, you get an advantage. And again, I'll comment later why it might be a good idea to use both of them and why it might be a bad idea to use both of them depending on the situation. So I'll comment on that after. Is appearance more confident? Appearance has been shown to work better recently. And so there has been a lot of focus on appearance features. That's what I use most of the time in my research. There's a lot of focus on appearance features. However, you still every now and then see a paper or two that shows very good results with geometric features. So it's not completely settled, but there's definitely nowadays a consensus that appearance features have a somewhat of an advantage. But again, combining them, if you know what you're doing, might be useful. But there are situations where you don't want to combine them. I'll comment on that in a second. Any other questions? Excuse me.
I was just
Yes.
thinking, with the case of the forehead,
Yes.
there's no shadow or change. I guess in a way you could deduce that the person isn't angry because there's no creasing, for example. But I assume that's just not enough information because there's too many possibilities still.
Yeah, but that's a good comment. But yeah, and the idea here with the filter, if you look at the filtered image below, after applying the filter, you see that the forehead, there aren't a lot of lines. There's not a lot of information. A lot of the pixels can be just set to 0, and the absence of information can also be considered to be information, right? So the absence of information around this area, there are no creases. That gives me also an indication that maybe that person, is not angry. And if there were creases, that might give me an information they're laughing or they're angry, or so So the absence of information is also useful in some situations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the absence of information, I think, is what I was getting at. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay, good. So examples of geometric feature extraction techniques. One of the most famous techniques is called the active shape model. So basically what the active shape model is, we are keeping track of facial landmarks. So the active shape model is a classic algorithm, and in computer science, an algorithm that was introduced in the 90s, that's classical. So it's a classical algorithm that basically doesn't use any machine learning. It's really neat and it's not mathematically too involved. If you're interested, you can take a look at how it works exactly. But I'm just going to give you the intuition. The idea is that we know the geometry of faces. We know that, vast majority of human beings have two eyes, two eyebrows, one nose, and one mouth, and there's a chin under them and underneath, and we know the relative position to each other. The eyes are going to be on top of the mouth is not going to be on top of the eyes. So we have quite a bit of information about the geometry of human beings, so we can create a mask. And so what we try to do with the active shape model is to fit that mask onto the face. Now, I won't go into the details how it's done, but you have the mask and you try to fit it onto the face. And once you get a good fit, then you've detected the facial landmarks. So that's the idea of the active shape model that is used, that is still extremely popular for facial landmark detection. And once you have detected these landmarks, you can look at their position relative to each other. You can look at, if you have a video, you can look at vectors of velocity. And these pieces of information, you feed them into a machine learning model. These would be your features. You feed them into a machine learning model, and you're hoping that the machine learning model can be trained to learn certain patterns in the data so that it can say, oh, this person is happy, this person is scared, this person is sad. So that's facial landmark. Also, similarly, you have the point tracking technique, which is quite similar to active shape model, except that you want to track certain points. You don't want to fit a mask every single frame. What you want to do is detect certain landmarks, certain points on the face, and you want to use a tracking algorithm as opposed to fitting a mask. You want to use a tracking algorithm to track that point across frames. So the typical tracking algorithm is that they use called the KLT, Knaid-Lucas-Thomasy algorithm, and it's an algorithm that allows you to track a group of pixels from one frame to another. So you detect a point, maybe using machine learning or manually, and you set a point around the corner of the eye, and then that point is tracked across frames, and then you could look at the movement of that point. And if you have a set of points, you can look at the movement of these points across frames in a video relative to each other, and that information can be fed to a machine learning algorithm. So it's quite similar to facial landmark detection, except the method is a bit different. You're not fitting a mask, you're just detecting some points initially and then tracking them. You can combine both. You can fit the mask in the first frame and then use tracking in the other frames as opposed to fitting the mask every frame. So both of them are compatible. Motion estimation, you're estimating the motion without really detecting points. You're just estimating the motion of the pixels across frames. The algorithm that is mostly used for this is called optical flow. And optical flow is just showing you vectors of movement for different pixels across frames. And you can take these vectors and feed them into a machine learning algorithm to infer some information about facial expressions. So these are just some of the ways where you can use geometric techniques. Now, any questions about the geometric techniques? Now, with the appearance techniques, you're using filters. And I'm just going to mention some of the famous filters. Two of them we're going to talk about in detail, so I'm not going to discuss them in detail today, but we're going to talk about them in detail in future lectures. And that's the Gabor filter and the histogram of gradients feature extraction technique. So we'll talk about these in detail. If you don't have a background in signal processing, don't worry, I introduced them in very simple terms. I give many examples so that you kind of understand what we're talking about. I try to avoid the vast majority of the math, okay? So this is not a image processing or signal processing course. I recognize that this is an interdisciplinary group, and so I try to take that into account. So don't be scared by the shape of this filter. Don't worry about it. We'll go over them in detail later. So Gabor filters are bandpass filters. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. I'll explain that later. It's a bandpass filter, but the beauty of this particular bandpass filter is that some researchers contend that it works in a similar way to the human cortical cells. The human cortical cells do some filtering on the information you are visualizing. When you're seeing images, the cortical cells do some filtration to get rid of the unimportant information, keep important information. And so if the human cortical cells do that, well, let's try to imitate. And that's what this filter does. It tries to imitate by eliminating some unnecessary information, keeping necessary information, and taking this information, feeding it into a machine learning algorithm. So that's Gabor filters. Then you have the histogram of gradients. And the idea of gradients in general, gradients are showing you areas that are interesting, areas where there's a lot of change. Because if you look at any facial expression, the interesting areas are areas where there's change, right? There's a shadow, so the values of the pixels are changing quite quickly. It goes from very dark to very bright, or there's an edge, and so you have black followed by something that is lighter than black, and so you have these sudden and significant changes in colors. And so gradients allow you to find these sudden changes in colors in the image. And we know that these sudden changes in the colors are important pieces of information. It's when nothing is changing, we don't care about, if nothing is changing, we really don't care about what's happening, right? But if there are sudden changes, these are pieces of information that we want to analyze. And so histogram of gradients relies on gradients, but also what it does is also it looks at the direction of change. Okay, what direction is the change is going in? And so it captures two pieces of information: where the change is, how significant that change is, and what is the direction of the change. And so I'm going to get back to that in future lectures, describe it in detail. Don't worry if you're not sure what I talked about here, but just giving you the intuition behind these filters. Another appearance-based techniques is the use of convolutional neural networks. So there was a question about, do we need to extract features when we are using deep learning? So there's a kind of a misunderstanding around deep learning. It says, oh, with deep learning, you don't need features. You don't need to extract features. You need to extract features, but the difference between deep learning techniques and other techniques is that you're not explicitly doing what we call feature engineering. So what's feature engineering? Feature engineering means we are trying to figure out the most useful features to solve a particular problem. That process of figuring out the most useful features to solve a problem is called feature engineering, okay? What pieces of information I should feed my AI model so that my AI model solves the problem that I want it to solve. So that's feature engineering. Conventional machine learning, non-deep learning machine learning, you have to do a lot of feature engineering. And feature engineering means that you have to have some sort of a knowledge about the domain so that you can do feature engineering properly. You have to kind of know what's relevant information, what's irrelevant information, so that you can figure out what your features should be. And so there's a bit of guesswork in some situations because sometimes it's really not clear which features are best. So it's called feature engineering, but there's a bit of guesswork and trial and error involved in feature engineering. So that's feature engineering. Then you have deep learning, where you're not going to do the feature engineering yourself. What you're going to do is let the neural network, the deep neural network, figure out what are the features, learn the features itself. The features are there. You're going to always need features, but it is the neural network. So when I say deep learning and neural networks, I'm referring to the same thing. Deep learning refers to deep neural networks, refers to basically a specific type of neural networks, okay? And so with deep learning, I'm just answering the questions. That's why I'm emphasizing this. You're not doing the feature engineering. You're not picking the features. It's the network that is figuring out the features, but after the network figures out the features, it's going to use these features to perform the estimation or classification of emotion. So features are always there. It's just that you did not engineer them. It's the network that figured them out itself. And one of the reasons why deep learning became so popular, as it turns out, the network is better at figuring out which features are most useful than us. So it typically performs better than human beings, given that you have a large enough data set. If you have a small data set, deep learning will perform absolutely miserably. You'll just get terrible results. But if you have large data sets, and if you're not sure what I mean by large data set, you're going to understand in a second, then you can get some absolutely interesting results. In this course, I'm not going to focus a lot on deep learning. In fact, I'm probably not going to not do deep learning at all. And that's because, again, this is an interdisciplinary course, and deep learning, if I'm going to dive into it, it's going to take a huge portion of the course. So I'm going to focus on machine learning techniques that you can learn quickly and you can benefit from quickly, and you can apply them to solve the problems of this course and a variety of problems. They're mathematically a bit less involved. They're easier to learn, and you can start applying them immediately. And they give you great results. Some of them give you, in many cases, better results than deep learning. Okay, so we talked about the two first steps of facial expression detection. If you remember, we were talking about the facial expression detection. We talked about face detection, feature extraction. Let's go to the third step, which is effect classification. Obviously, the most important step. Popular machine learning methods used for effect estimation. You have the support vector machine. We're going to talk about support vector machines in detail. You have decision trees. We're going to learn about decision trees in details. You have random forests. We're going to learn about random forests in detail. And you have deep neural networks. That's the only one that I'm not going to talk about in this course. I'll mention it, every now and then, but I'm not going to dive too deeply into the theory. However, when you're doing your assignment, you are more than welcome to use deep learning if you have experience in deep learning. In fact, a lot of students did last year. That was the first year I give this course. A lot of students did use deep learning. Some of them did not know deep learning and wanted to learn it, so they learned it on their own. They used it for their assignment, and some already had some knowledge. But the vast majority of students use the methods that we saw in class. Okay, so how does it work? And again, this might sound very simplistic to somebody who's done machine learning, but again, take into account this is an interdisciplinary course. We have students coming from many disciplines, so bear with me if you have done machine learning and you find this to be too introductory. That's very important to make sure everybody's on the same page, okay? So here's what we do. First, in order to what is the format of the feature? Is it similar to bag of words, TF, IDF? Oh, okay, so I got a question in the chat. What is the format of the features? Is it similar to bag of words and TF, IDF? So bag of words, TF, IDF are features that we use in natural language processing. Here, we're still focusing on bag of words. You can also use it in image processing, but it's not as popular as natural language processing. So here we are focusing on image processing, and at the end of the day, features are just, you know, numbers. Bag of words is just a vector of number. DFIDF is just, these are numbers. Yes, they're numbers, but they have a different significance. By the way, I'm going to talk in this lecture about bag of words, but that's going to come later. So just bear with me. When I talk about natural language processing, I'll mention bag of words and explain how it works. But now we're focusing more on image processing. Is it pixel values in a matrix format? Yes, typically whenever you want to process an image, you read it in a matrix format. So you would have a matrix that represents the pixel in an image. If it's a grayscale, you have a two-dimensional matrix. And if it's a colored picture, you have a three-dimensional matrix, because you have, you know, the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, and then the depth would be the color, red, green, or blue. Any other questions? Okay. So here's how classification works. You have a data set. So what is the data set? Keep talking about data set. So data set is just a bunch of examples of solutions of the problem we want eventually to solve. So for instance, I want an AI model to learn how to detect emotions. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, I give it a bunch of examples. I give it a bunch of images of people displaying a variety of facial expressions. And I tell it, okay, this person is happy, this person is sad, this person is angry, this person is disgusted. And I give it as many examples as possible. The larger my data set is, the better. And so that's what I'm showing here. I have a data set, I have a bunch of examples of images, and I have labels. Labels are basically the solution. So I would have a label associated with this image saying, well, you know, this person is happy, this person is happy, this person is sad, and so forth, or this image is sad. So I would have the images and the solution. And I enter into a process called training. So I would extract features from the images, and I combine the features with the labels, and I enter into a process called training. I'm training the AI model. So I'm representing the AI model here, the machine learning model, using this black box here, or, you know, just a generic box. Okay, so the idea of training is to give my AI model, my machine learning model, enough examples so that it can start seeing patterns in the data. Okay, and then hopefully it trains to recognize emotion, so that next time if I feed it an image that is not from the data set, because if it's from the data set, it would be too easy. I give it an image that is not from the data set, and it can classify that this image is showing somebody who is happy. And if I am still assessing the performance of my system, I would have the solution, but I wouldn't give it to the machine learning model. I would just let it guess, and then I would check if it got it right. And if it got it right, great. If it didn't get it right, I would count that as a mistake, and I would assess the performance accordingly. And we're going to see many performance metrics that we use in machine learning later on in the course. So this is how I would go about training and classifying. Again, from a very high level point of view, we're going to see more details later. Any questions?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I think I have more of a kind of a comment or question.
Yes.
Because I feel like a lot of facial expressions are very subtle. And then if you're trying to train a model, like, wouldn't it be difficult to catch subtle expressions, but then at the same time not overfit your machine learning so that it applies to like a different variance of people, like someone who's 65 versus someone who's like 10? are going to have different wrinkles in different places. So how does it kind of catch the difference and not overfit at the same time? Like catch the subtle behaviors, but not overfit at the same time.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This is really where most of the challenges lie today. Um, Early in the early days, and we're getting ahead of ourselves, but that's fine. I'll talk about that now. In the early days of effective computing, when we were focused quite a bit on facial expression recognition, what we would do is we would fit images. I don't know, these are small images, but I don't know if you can see them properly. But we would fit images that look like this, where you're showing, quite exaggerated expressions to train a machine learning model. Okay. Now, where do we get these images from? You notice these images are the subjects in these images are wearing the same shirt, same background. They're quite uniform. It's really trying to help me, just focus on the important information. Where do we get these images from? Here's what used to happen. We would ask subjects to come to the lab and we would tell them, show me a happy face, show me an angry face. These are called posed data sets. So you'd have, sometimes you would hire actors to do it, okay? So these are posed data sets. Posed data sets are really easy. You can get amazing results with posed data sets. You're gonna see for your assignment where I'm gonna use a posed data set, because this is, this is not a research project, it's an assignment. You're going to develop a machine learning algorithm that is extremely emotionally intelligent if all humans display were posed data sets. You can learn posed data sets very quickly. However, as soon as you get into the real world where people, first of all, they have different amount of wrinkles on their faces and also tend to display subtle facial expressions. Sometimes they're so subtle, we call them micro expressions. They're really subtle. We see them, but they give computers a really hard time. Then this model that you developed and you're proud of because it's 99% accurate, it's going to fail miserably. And I think I mentioned that in the last lecture. If I didn't, I'll mention it again. There was a huge joke in the field about Microsoft, who introduced a library they were proud of because it worked very well, in their testing. And then whenever somebody would use it to detect subtle emotions, it would give a completely wrong answer. It was just miserably wrong because they trained it on posed expressions. And so the direction now, and this is what I do in my research, this is what everybody's doing right now, the direction is to collect what we call spontaneous data sets. So this is something I was going to cover later, but I'll mention it now to answer your question. So the goal of collecting spontaneous data sets is that we are filming people interacting with other people, maybe you talking to somebody else, casual conversation, or you watching a movie or watching the ad of a particular product. And so what you capture is really subtle emotions, because these people were not asked to show emotions. These people were just asked to have a conversation or were asked a few questions and they were told to answer these questions. And so the emotions tend to be quite subtle. Now you want to collect a large data set and you want to train your machine learning model to detect emotions on this data set. Now this is the challenge, and now this is when your machine learning algorithm will struggle. And if you get 75% accuracy, you're really throwing a huge party and calling yourself a genius, because you're not going to get there. And so this is really where people are focused now. In terms of different ages and different skin tones and different amount of wrinkles, that's a general problem in image processing and machine learning in general. Unfortunately, most data sets, not just for effective computing, but even for face detection, are biased. There was a lot of a fuss around a recent paper that was published in 2019 that showed that machine learning algorithms that detect faces very well if you're white and if you're male. And as soon as you go into older ethnic subjects, the accuracy tends to go down. And the reason why that happens is because when we train these algorithms, we didn't feed them enough data from these populations. And the same problem applies to effective computing. If we don't have a large enough data set that's going to show examples from all these populations, machine learning algorithms are terrible at interpolating. Like human beings are good at interpolating and extrapolating. If 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 you are seeing something that is somewhat similar to something you've seen previously, but it's not exactly the same, you can interpolate. Machine learning algorithms, if they're seeing, the facial expression of an older individual and they've never seen an older individual, they fail miserably. They're not really good at, interpolating. And so that is why you have to provide it with enough examples so that it learns. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I was kind of almost wondering, could you make a model that works just as good for someone who's 8 years old as does someone who's a different skin tone and let's say 60, and not have it like overfit? Do you because they're so different. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, it doesn't have to overfit, and yes, you can. Absolutely, you can. Um, the key is in the data, not in the nature of the machine learning algorithm, because you can conceive quite complex, especially when you're talking about neural networks, you can conceive quite complex and deep neural networks that can easily handle these problems, given that you have enough data. So one of the problems you have in this area is that sometimes when we're collecting a data set, we tend to follow a scientific convention that completely fails in AI, and that is we want to collect a representative sample. So let's say you have in a population, in a population you have maybe 80% white and 10 or 12% African Americans or Canadian African Canadians. And so if your set of subjects is representative of the population, then you're going to have, for every 10 images of somebody who is black, you're going to have 80 or 90 images of somebody who is white. That's representative of the population. But that means you're also given less examples of the minority group, and then therefore your algorithm is going to perform poorly for that minority group. And so that comes from the scientific convention that your sample should be representative of the population. But in AI, it should not. You should provide equal examples of each a group so that you can teach it enough. But yeah, if you have a large enough data set, you show it enough examples, it can do it. You will need complex models that are deep enough, but it absolutely can be done, and it has been done.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. So there's a comment or question. I think the key is the cross-validation data set. So I don't know what you mean by cross-validation data set. I think you mean the training/validation data set. Absolutely. The key is in the training data set. So typically you have 3 data sets: training, validation, and testing. And sometimes you combine the training and validation together in order to perform cross-validation and the training and validation together. So maybe you can call it cross-validation data set. But yeah, the key is to have a big enough training data set. But even the testing data set, if it's not large enough, then your performance assessment is not as accurate as you would like it to be. But I don't want to jump ahead of myself and confuse other students that might not be comfortable with these notions. So let's take it one step at a time. Any other questions? Body expression. So some researchers maintain, especially, many years ago, and this does not really reflect recent opinion, that gestures are not very useful to detect emotions because they just are associated with the spoken verbs. They're not really adding new information. They're just associated with whatever you're seeing with the spoken verb, but they don't on their own add any new information to the conversation. They're just not adding any new information. However, recently, this idea is starting to change, and a lot of researchers are starting to focus on body expression. Hand gestures can convey emotions, but also if you go beyond hand gesture, just posture conveys quite a bit of emotional information. And so there's quite a bit of research on body expression, especially in terms of posture to detect emotions. Now, how do you keep track of body expressions, of gestures, of posture? So there are two ways of doing this. There are two ways of keeping track of gestures or gait. Gait is the way you walk, or movements of the human body in space. There are marker-based solutions and markerless solutions. So the marker-based solutions are not very practical for effective computing, but they're very accurate. So you put some markers, these are stickers or little balls on the body, and you use multiple cameras in order to keep track of these markers on the body. And that gives you a very accurate assessment of the body movement in the 3D world. Okay, and so you can take that information and extract features from that information to feed it to machine learning to assess emotions. And then you have the markerless solutions. The markerless solutions do not use markers at all. And so obviously they're not as accurate, but they're more practical. So the markerless solutions rely quite heavily on machine learning. You have markerless solutions that simply use cameras, and these are obviously solutions that are not going to be very accurate because cameras are not capturing a 3D imagery, right? They're just capturing, a 2D image. And so from a 2D image to be able to extrapolate and figure out the movements in the 3D world, you're going to lose some accuracy because you're making just a rough estimate. And then you have other cameras that have on board a depth sensor to help it with the depth problem. So you have these 2D images, but we also have depth information, how far things are from the camera. Depth sensors typically use infrared signals. They shoot an infrared signal, it bounces on the body, comes back to the camera, and the amount of time it takes to come back tells the camera how far you are or how far particular body part is from the camera, and that allows it to estimate depth. So you combine the 2D image with depth and you get better assessment of 3D movements. And that's what Microsoft Kinect, the famous cameras, use. Or you can use wearables. Any wearable sensor that has an IMU, inertial measurement unit. An inertial measurement unit is basically an accelerometer combined with a gyroscope. It allows you to, and you have it on, every phone has it now. It allows you to keep track of movements. And so if you have the capacity to add sensors on the body, then you can use these sensors to track movement. But again, it's not very practical if you're going to ask somebody to wear sensors so you can track their hand gestures. I'd rather contactless solutions, but contactless solutions without markers tend to be more challenging. Typical body expression features, the type of features that you would extract from information you extracted about the body movements. So you would look at velocity of the body parts, acceleration of the body parts, amount of movement, joint position relative to each other or angle between joints, type of movement, and that type of movement is is kind of a loaded feature because you have to do quite a bit of analysis to figure out the type of movement. Is it contraction, expansion, upward movement, orientation of body parts, and so forth. So these are the types of piece of information that you would extract to feed to a machine learning algorithm. If you're interested in body expression, I'm not going to go into a lot of details. You can take a look at the chapter that I posted as a reading for this lecture. This is a chapter, a book chapter that I wrote on, affect modalities. And in the chapter, I give a lot of references to studies that use body expression and what kind of features they use and how do they use these features in order to gain understanding of emotions. Okay, so before we talk about audio, we're gonna take a 10-15 minutes break, so just to give you a break, and then once we're done with the break, we'll come back. So let's come back at 7:10. Okay, 7:10 we'll resume the lecture. Let's just take a break for now, come back at 7:10, and we'll take it from there. Any questions before the break? Okay, we'll come back at 7:10. Okay, hello everyone, we're back. So let's, before we continue, I just want to talk about assignment 2. Is everybody back? You guys can hear me? Just let me know in the chat box. Am I talking to myself now? Okay, good. Okay, that's great. Oh, by the way, when I mentioned that we're gonna be back at 7:10, and it wasn't clear what time zone, it got me curious. Can you please let me know in the chat box, where are you located right now? Which country, which city? Just, out of curiosity. Let's see who's in Ottawa and who's outside of Ottawa. Okay, well, so we have mostly Ottawa. We have someone from China. I mean, obviously, I would have preferred to have this course in person, but maybe at some point we'll look back fondly on this. Having these online courses where we have students from Toronto, from China. It's quite interesting how we're doing it. Yes, nothing replaces in-person lectures. I'm honestly having a hard time adjusting and figuring out how to lecture online. I feel like I'm talking to a screen, so I really don't get in the zone of presenting. But also it has its advantages. You guys are sitting at home, you're comfortable from wherever you are, so yeah, that's a good thing too. When I'm done, I'm just gonna close this session and I'll go play with my kids. I don't have to commute back home, so there's a silver lining there. Okay, I want to talk about, if everybody's back, I want to talk a little bit about assignment 2. The earlier I talk about it, the better. And the deadline is still far away from now, but let's talk about it now so that you know what's coming. So I'm just opening the assignment. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so that's assignment 2. As you see, it's due October 23rd. So you still have quite a bit of time. This is a group assignment, okay? As opposed to assignment 1 is the only individual assignment. This one is a group assignment, so you'll have a group by then. I'm just waiting to hear back from you if you've created your own group, and if not, please fill the list. I sent a link for that list so that I can assign you a group. So you have until October 23rd, and the assignment is also about effective computing. And the idea is that you'll write a short survey paper about one of the following effective computing application areas: effective computing in education, effective computing in robotics, emotive internet, effective computing in telehealth applications, maybe assistive robots you can talk about in this area, effective computing and autism. And some people are proposing all sorts of systems for children with autism, especially children with autism that involve effective computing technologies. Effective computing and mental illness. This is something that I've done research in, and the TA of this course is actually an expert on this topic because that's her PhD thesis. She's my student and she's doing her PhD on effective computing and mental illness. How can we use effective computing methods to diagnose bipolar disorder, depression, and so forth. Effective computing and gaming, effective computing and virtual agents. Crowd emotions is another interesting topic that has recently seen some interest. How do you estimate not the emotion of an individual, but the emotion, the overall emotion of crowds? And it has applications in crowd control. It has applications in the movie industry. If you want to screen a movie to see if it's generating the emotions that you're expecting it to generate. For instance, it's a horror movie and nobody's scared. Well, you know, on your test screen, you know things are not going well. So, and there have been companies that also develop technologies for test screening that rely on effective computing strategies. So depending on how many teams we have, if we don't have a lot of teams, I would rather that everybody has a different topic. But if we have enough teams, maybe we don't have enough topics for all the teams, so we'll have a maximum of 2 groups can work on the topic. The way it works is after I send you an email saying registration is open, you have to wait until I send that email. Registration for the topic is open. Then you, your team leader on your team, will have to send me an email telling me which topic you would like to work on. If you are the first one to choose the topic or second, because we have a maximum of 2 groups here that can work on a topic, you can reserve that topic. If two groups already reserved that topic, you cannot reserve that topic, so you have to choose something else. So what I would recommend is that you give me 3 topics. This way, you know, if you don't get your preferred topic, maybe the second one, you get the second one. So give me 3 topics in order of priority. This way, you don't just suggest one topic and I tell you, oh, it's been taken. Then, you know, you have to suggest another one, and all of the other topics are also, all the good topics that you want are taken. And so just suggest your top 3, and, you know, if the first one's not available, I would assign you maybe there's a second one.
Hello,
So
Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
So do you mean we need to send an email to you as well as the TA, rather than only TA?
Yes, me and the TA.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, and when we open the registration period, I'll be sending an email describing exactly what you need to do. Send me an email to me and the TA, and ideally specify 3 topics. I'll explain that in the email.
Okay, so there is also a time that you announce is that up is the beginning time?
Yes, the beginning of the registration period, so that you can register for a course.
Okay.
Or for a topic, sorry.
Thank you.
So what you're going to do is you're going to work on a survey paper. In the survey paper, you're going to discuss one of these state-of-the-art topics. And you're going not only to survey existing state-of-the-art work on these topics, but also you're going to try to define a gap in the papers that you surveyed. Meaning, okay, you've surveyed some papers and this is what they're discussing. These are the solutions they're proposing, but there's a gap. There's a window where, you know, of opportunity to do further research. Nobody addressed that topic. There's something that we can try. There's an idea that they really didn't properly touch on in existing papers. And so that's something that we can address in future work. So that's what addressing a gap is. specifying a gap. So here are some proposed survey sections. You don't have to follow this exact structure, but if you don't follow this exact structure and your structure is not good, well, you're going to lose marks. So if you really want to be on the safe side, just follow the structure. So you're going to have an abstract, provide a summary of the paper, introduction, introduce effective computing, and the application area you're talking about, discuss the need to use effective computing to solve problems in the area. Excuse me. Then you're going to have a section, survey of the works. This is where you survey existing state-of-the-art works in the area that you've chosen. You're going to identify existing challenges in this area, and then you're going to do a gap analysis where you're going to identify one or more gaps, at least one gap, that something that hasn't been addressed yet. You're not going to address it, you're not going to solve the problem, but you're going to identify the problem. That's a really important step in research, to figure out, to learn how to identify gaps. A lot of the times, students don't struggle in the technical part, especially if the students with a technical background, they struggle with the gap identification. They come to me and they're like, yeah, I can do this and that. And I ask them, what is your contribution? What's the gap you're addressing? And this is where the whole idea falls apart. So it's good to think in terms of, what can I address? What can I add? What is the gap in existing state-of-the-art work? And there's always a little gap that you can identify. I'm not saying you're going to identify something of a breakthrough, but there's always, a lane that you can say, oh, if research is done along this line, it can lead to something important. And then conclusions, summarize the main takeaways from your paper by very briefly mentioning what has been done, what are the main challenging, and what is the potential future work in this area. So the paper is not long, it's just 4 pages on the ACM template. I posted the ACM template online. You're going to use that template to write your paper. Do not change the font size on the template so that you don't have to write too much, or don't include figures that you don't need. It's okay to include figures, but if they don't add anything to the paper, you're going to lose marks, because you're just trying to fill space, right? Or putting oversized images. Just don't do any of these things. You guys are graduate students. You shouldn't do these things. Also, in addition to the survey paper, you're going to submit PowerPoint presentation at the same time with the survey paper. You're going to submit your survey paper on Turnitin, and you're going to submit your presentation by email to me and the TA. The reason why you submit a presentation is because you're going to present your survey. So in this course, you'll notice I talk a lot about effective computing, the theory behind it. I don't talk about areas. I leave that up to you guys to provide presentations about the areas of applications. So I don't discuss applications. It's you who's going to discuss applications in this course. This is a graduate course, and it's not just about you listening to me talk. I know that's can be boring, and so I want everybody to be involved. So we're going to have a lecture where each group will provide a 10 minutes presentation. We'll see how that goes over Zoom. Obviously, there will be certain hiccups, but we'll figure it out. So everybody's going to present, every group's going to provide a 10 minutes presentation. All team members have to participate in the presentation, and you're marked based on the survey paper and the presentation. And I have a marking scheme that you can take a look at, and the marking scheme is used by the TA to mark your assignment. So the presentation is worth 30 points out of the 100 points for that assignment. Any questions about the assignment?
I just have a question about the gaps. Is it okay, because some papers reference their own, like where they could have gone next?
Yes.
Is that okay to reference, or should it be really outside of anything they've discussed?
I'm okay with that, as long as you describe that gap in detail. Yeah, no, I'm okay with that. That's fine. A lot of papers will mention future work, and I was going to mention that the future work section in these papers can influence your gap. But be careful. A lot of the papers will mention future work. However, some of them will mention future work. That's because this is future work they are actually working on. You want to make sure that if the paper you're surveying is from 2017, they didn't publish what they said they're working on for future work in 2020. Okay, so you want to make sure that that's not published. But if it's a paper from 2020 and it talks about future work, chances are nobody has published that yet. And so that will count as a gap. But if it's something that's already been published, but because you're relying on an old paper that said this is future work, that's not valid. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Applications in classrooms, yes, especially now, actually. I know a lot of you would like to hide your faces, but you know, with Zoom classes, you can integrate effective capabilities to Zoom to give the instructor live feedback about level of engagement, how bored students are, how engaged, how focused they are. You can extract quite a bit of information from facial expressions and postures and provide it in real time to the instructor. That would be quite useful to the instructor, especially, you know, online teaching is not a natural thing. I mean, this is the, you know, I'm not quite used to it as much as, you know, physical lectures. So applications in classrooms and also applications in virtual classrooms would be useful. So that, and by the way, you see these topics that I propose, you don't have to pick any of them. You can just propose your own and tell me, you know what, I want to research this application, this area of applications. You didn't really mention it, and that's totally fine. Also, if you pick a topic, sometimes you're going to notice that it might overlap with another topic. For instance, if you're looking at effective computing and telehome health, you might start looking at assistive robots. But these are robots, and there's another topic about robots. That's okay. It's okay to have overlap. Or effective computing and autism. There's a lot of research around the idea of using robots to interact with children with autism. And, you know, adding effective capability to robots. I haven't seen any research work on this, but, you know, this is something that has been proposed many times. I proposed it in some of my papers, but never got the chance to do it. And so, you know, if you talk about robots and you're talking about effective computing and autism, that's totally fine. So if there's an overlap in between the areas, that's okay. Any questions about assignment 2? Okay, so let's continue our lecture. As I promised at the beginning of the term, basically last week, I'll try to never keep you until 8:30. So I'll try, or even at 8:20. And we're supposed to end the lecture at 8:20, actually. I'll try to finish it earlier. If we don't finish all the slides, there's always the next lecture we continue. So I don't want to, you know, keep you too late. Trying to share what's happening. I'm having an interesting problem. My mouse disappeared. My cursor disappeared. That's so interesting. Really. Sorry about that. Just give me a second. I have no idea what's happening. Okay, finally, we're back in business. Sorry about that. I'm going to share my screen. And we're good to go. Good, everybody can see the screen, I suppose. So we can go back to the lecture. Okay. So this is where we stopped. Audio. So we've talked about the visual modality. Let's move on to the audio modality. Speech carries two interrelated informational channels. The linguistic information that expresses the semantics of the message, the meaning of the message, and you have the implicit paralinguistic information conveyed through the intonation, the tone, basically. Both of these channels carry valuable affective information, and so we're going to explore both of these channels. The linguistic channel is a speech channel, is basically what the person is saying. If the person is interacting with a virtual assistant or a computer and it's informing them that they're frustrated, chances are they are frustrated. So we tend to express our emotions. Sometimes we don't, depending on the social situation, depending on the context, depending on our personality, but sometimes we do. And so we don't want an effective computer to miss that piece of information. Obviously, an effective computer cannot be emotionally intelligent if it does not listen to what the person is saying, the meaning of the speech, beyond facial expressions, beyond the tone, but also what they're saying is very important. So this technique of effect recognition falls under the wider topic of sentiment analysis and opinion mining using natural language processing. So we borrow techniques from natural language processing. Natural language processing is an area where we use computer algorithms to try to make sense of the meaning of text or speech. So the steps, basically, if you are talking with the computer, if you are not using text, but actually interacting through speech with the computer, then the first step is to use an automatic speech recognition algorithm to convert the speech into text, because we want to convert it into text so that we can make sense of it. If you are interacting through text, you're sending it, you're typing text messages, you don't need that. You can skip that step. But if you are interacting with a virtual assistant like Alexa or Siri, you are talking. And so the first step is to convert the speech into text. The second step is to make sense of that text. So this approach of effect recognition has its pitfalls because it's not universal, right? You have to develop a model for every single dialect. And, you develop a model for the English language. Well, that's not going to work for French. You have to, that's just common sense. So you have to spend a lot of effort developing models for different dialects and training these models on different dialects and languages and so forth. So that becomes a challenge. But also, speech is quite vulnerable to masking. And sometimes we mask even though we want to express our emotions. So I might tell you, if I'm frustrated and you ask me, are you frustrated? I'll tell you, I'm fine. I'm not fine. I'm clearly frustrated. The semantics of what I said is I'm fine. I said I'm fine. But my gestures are saying that I'm not fine. My posture is saying that I'm not fine. My facial expressions are showing that I'm frustrated, right? But the speech semantics is saying that I'm fine. So that can be tricky. If you are only looking at speech, then the computer might be fooled completely and miss important information that a human being would not miss, right? Nobody would think that this person is fine if they say, oh, I'm fine. Of course they're not fine. So that's one of the challenges also, and the challenge associated with the speech channel, use of speech channel to detect affect or sentiment. Okay, so let's talk about sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is when, instead of detecting the emotions in the text, we try to assess the sentiment in the text, going from negative to positive sentiment. It simplifies the problem. And so I'm going to talk about three main sentiment analysis techniques. If you look at different studies, maybe they'll have different categorizations, but I just defining here three broad categories of sentiment analysis techniques. The first one is called the lexicon-based technique. Second one is statistical learning techniques. This is where we use machine learning. And the third one is a hybrid technique where we combine lexicon-based and statistical learning techniques. So for the lexicon-based technique, we classify effect based on the presence of certain keywords that we know carry effective information. We know that these words, the presence of this word means something. For instance, if we see the word happy in a sentence, well, maybe that's reflecting a positive sentiment. If we see the word angry, that's an effective word. That means, you know, that's a negative emotion. Frustrated, that's a negative emotion. And so we have these words that we put in a dictionary, and we associate values with these words that correspond to their sentiment reflection. So for instance, happy would be associated with a value, with a number that is positive, because that's a positive sentiment. However, sad would be associated with a negative number. And depending on how intense the emotion described by the particular word, then we would set the value of that number. So happy, maybe it would have a large positive number, and depressed would have a large negative number. However, maybe content would have a smaller positive number than happy. And so we create this dictionary, and obviously there's a bit of subjectivity in the creation of this dictionary. And so when we're analyzing text, we try to see if there are words in this text that belong to our dictionary, and we pull these words, and so they're in the dictionary, and we calculate an overall score based on these words. So I'm going to show you an example. So basically, we just add up the sentiment score for all these words. We aggregate them together to get a final score. So I'm going to show you in a second how it works using a very simplified example. But let me talk a little bit about statistical learning techniques. We generate features from the text to apply machine learning algorithms. This is really the most popular way of doing this. Get features from the text, like bag of words or word embeddings. I'm going to explain how bag of words works, how word embeddings work. And somebody asked about TF-IDF. Unfortunately, I don't have it in my slides, but it's also another feature that is commonly used with machine learning. Hybrid technique is just combining both. So let's take a look at these techniques in more detail. Let's start with the sentiment analysis using a lexicon-based sentiment analysis. So we'd have a dictionary, and I have a really silly example here, just to illustrate the concept. So I have a dictionary of a bunch of words. Some words have a positive a sentiment associated with them, like has +2. Some of them are neutral, like class, material, feel. Some of them have a positive sentiment, but it's not as large, let's say, as like learning is +1, although it could be -1. Boring is -2. Professor is neutral, 0. So this is just an example, okay? And so it typically, you know, obviously the dictionaries are far larger than this. They have lots of words. Maybe not all the words in the language, but you know, a sizable subset of the language, of the words in the language. And so consider the following sentence. I like this class material. I feel I'm learning, although the professor is boring. I hope that's not how you feel. So let's see. Like gives you +2. I pulled that from the dictionary. This is a word in the dictionary. It gives me +2. Class is 0, material 0, feel 0, learning +1, although -1, professor 0, boring -2. So we add all these numbers together, and that gives me 0. That's a neutral sentiment. If it gave me a large positive number, I would say this is positive sentiment. If it gives me a negative number, I would say this is a negative number. 0 or something close to 0 would be neutral sentiment. So this is how it's done. And you can add on top of this basic idea some layers of complexity. Like for instance, you can also take a look at words that negate what comes after them. So if I have the word not followed by happy, that switches the sign. So if happy was +2 or +3, it becomes -3, right? So it switches the sign of that word. So, there are, things that are built on top of this simple idea to make it a little bit more robust. And believe it or not, it kind of works. It's easy to fool it. It makes major mistake when it fails. It fails spectacularly, but sometimes it kind of works. And you have a lot of sentiment analysis libraries out there. A lot of them are open source that are based on this simple idea. Just use a dictionary, calculate a score, and assess sentiment that way. Is there a
Professor?
question? Yes, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Is there a way for it to detect sarcasm in some sense? And
it's not very, yeah, that's one, actually that's one of the major challenges in natural language processing in general, but also for lexicon based methods, they really do miserably on sarcasm. So straightforward statements, you might get a good sense of the sentiment polarity, but sarcasm, it just doesn't really handle it well at all. And that's why I said when it fails spectacularly. You might be sarcastic and mean something completely different, and the machine just completely misses the point. So yeah, it doesn't handle sarcasm very well.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So before we process this sentence, do we filter out those common words like I, this, or maybe they are in the dictionary and they have the score like 0, and so it doesn't really matter.
So what you want to do is pull any word that is in the dictionary. If a word is not in the dictionary, you ignore it. But obviously, yeah, this is a silly example. The dictionary doesn't have a lot of words, but typically, words like I, this would have a 0 if they're defined in the dictionary. So if you don't find the word in the dictionary, you ignore it. If you find the word in the dictionary, then you associate it with a score. Can also take a positive value. Yes, it can. Yeah, that's why I said, this is a bit of a silly example. This is not a real dictionary. This is a dictionary I created just for this example. So you're right. Although can be positive in some situations. So sometimes in a dictionary where a word can go either way, you just avoid it completely altogether and just not define it in the dictionary. So yes, I agree with you. Although can also be positive. So that's not a real dictionary. The purpose of this is just to illustrate how it works, not these values are not quite accurate. This is just an example I completely made up, just to illustrate how it works.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Bag of words. Bag of words is a classic feature in natural language processing. So now I'm talking about the features that we typically use for statistical learning techniques. So we would collect these features and we'd feed them to a machine learning algorithm. So bag of words is one of the most popular ones, and it's popular because it's so simple, but also it works very well. I mean, in some instances, it gives you some interesting results. Again, this is still struggles with sarcasm. It's not completely bulletproof, but it kind of works in many contexts. And that is why even in modern research, we still use bag of words. We almost never use bag of words on its own by itself. We combine it with other features. But bag of words has been around for a while. It's a popular feature that you feed to a machine learning algorithm to make sense of text. And so I'm going to explain it for that purpose. And the idea of bag of words is that you're looking at the frequency of the occurrence of certain words or words in the text. So for instance, if I have the sentence, Alice prepared well for the exam, Bob prepared too. Unfortunately, Bob did not do well on the exam, Bob failed the exam. So what I'm going to do is I have certain words that I'm interested in, and I'm going to count the frequency of these words. So I have 1 Alice, 2 prepare, 2 well, 1 for. And so if I count the frequency of words and in my sentence, I get a vector, right? 1, 2, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1. And so I get a vector representation of that sentence. Guess what? Machine learning algorithms love vectors. Now, this is a short vector. It would be a longer vector. Machine learning algorithms love vectors. Why? Because if you train it on enough vectors, it'll start to notice patterns. Start to notice, oh, when this word is frequently found, in addition to this word also being frequently found, in addition to this word not frequently found, it tends to be a positive sentiment, right? So it starts to figure out these patterns, because that's what machine learning does. And so you're feeding tons of vectors, you're training it on these vectors, and eventually it starts to develop understanding of these patterns. And so the idea is to vectorize this sentence, represent it as a bag of words, and then train a machine learning based on bag of words. And it kind of works. It's not perfect, but it kind of works. And you know, a lot of the times it gives us better results than lexicon based. Now, the state of the art is to use word embeddings. This is what everybody wants to use now, word embeddings. Sometimes we combine word embeddings with other features like bag of words. Sometimes we even combine, that's the hybrid technique, we combine lexicon-based and machine learning, that's the hybrid. But everybody that works in natural language processing nowadays has to somewhat incorporate word embeddings. And if they want to avoid using word embeddings and publish, then the first question they're going to get during peer review is, why didn't you use word embeddings? Because they're quite powerful. So let's talk about word embeddings. I'm going to describe word embeddings in a very simplified manner, because otherwise we can drown in math. So I'm going to give you the intuition behind word embeddings as opposed to just dive into the math, because I can take 5 hours and we wouldn't be done talking about word embeddings. So it's an involved topic. But if I give you the intuition, you're going to develop a good understanding what word embeddings are, and you're going to be able to use them. And they're powerful. So let's talk about word embeddings briefly. So word embedding is a vector representation of a word. So again, machine learning algorithms love numbers, love vectors. So if I can represent words using vectors, then maybe I can teach a machine learning algorithm to make sense of speech or text. But I'm not going to use a random vector to represent a word. There must be some sort of a strategy to associate words with vectors. And the strategy is all about the semantic information captured in the word, or the semantic relationship between words. So let me suppose that I want to represent words using 2D vectors. The reason why I'm saying 2D vectors is because I can draw 2D vectors very easily on a screen. But typically you're dealing with vectors that are at least 300 dimensions or more than 300 dimensions. But let's say I want to represent words using 2D vectors, okay? So the idea of word embeddings is that, let's say this vector here represents the word car. And this vector here represents the word truck. And this vector represents the word ball. So you notice the vector for car and truck, the distance between them, the distance between these points is smaller than the distance between ball and car, because car and truck are more semantically related than car and ball, right? Car and truck, they're both vehicles, they're more semantically related than car and ball. And so the idea is to associate each word with a vector while making sure that words that have are semantically related are their vectors, the distance between their vectors is small, and words that are not semantically related, the distance between their vectors is large. So that's the trick here. Okay, and so now these vectors carry semantic information, right? And so if I train a machine learning algorithm to figure out that when I mention a certain word like frustrated, that's negative sentiment, and then in a different sentence, I don't use the word frustrated, I use the word, another word close to frustrated, distressed or something like that, or upset. And machine learning algorithm hasn't seen the word upset in this context, but it knows that frustrated and upset are semantically related. And I've kind of been trained on the word upset, and I know frustrated and upset are close to each other. I can still make sense of what is being said. So that's just the intuition behind it, to create these vectors that are that carry semantic meaning. So how is this done? How do you generate these vectors? That's the million-dollar question. How do you get these vectors? Well, here's a silly example that I just, made up. Okay, let's assume I want to describe programming languages in terms of vectors, and I want these vectors to capture their difficulty and popularity of the programming languages. So I have Python, JavaScript, PHP, Java, R, Ruby. I have a bunch of programming languages, and I want to describe them in terms of their difficulty to learn and popularity. And so I would assign to each programming language a score between 0 and 100 on the difficulty scale and popularity scale. For instance, Python is kind of easy to learn and it's extremely popular. So 90 popularity, 10 difficulty. JavaScript is more difficult, but it's really popular. It's all over the place. PHP a little bit more difficult, but less popular, and so forth. And by the way, you don't have to agree with that assessment. This is just completely my subjective assessment. So for the sake of this example, okay? So each programming language, therefore, can be represented using a 2D vector, right? I can just, the vector for Python is 1090. That's the vector. The vector for Java is 3285. So each programming language is associated with a vector. And the programming languages whose vectors are close to each other, the distance between the vectors is small, then these are similar programming languages in terms of the characteristics of difficulty and popularity. And the ones that are far, well, these are different programming. They're kind of more different than because the distance between the vectors is large. And so that's basically the intuition behind word embeddings. However, what I've just proposed is really not that practical. So it has many problems. Problem number one, it's subjective, right? What I've done is subjective. You might look at this table and you tell me, you've given Java a really high score for popularity, and it's kind of a language that is dying down. And the reason, yes, is because I love Java. So, I'm biased in this case. So it's subjective. This was based on my own, most likely biased opinion. That's the first problem. Second problem, we cannot describe all words using just 2 dimensions. Even programming languages, you cannot describe them using 2 dimensions. It doesn't really summarize everything about the programming languages. Maybe I want to look at how supported a programming language is with open source libraries, right? So we cannot summarize words using 2 dimensions. So that was a kind of a silly way of looking at it. The third problem is that we would have to exhaustively and manually create a vector for each word in a language. And that's just a huge effort that is required to create, to define all these dimensions and to create a vector for each, maybe define 300, 400 dimensions and create a vector for each word in the language and make sure that words that are related their vectors are not too far from each other. That's just really crazy. That's just impossible to do manually. And so we need a better strategy. And so in order to come up with a better strategy, we have to go back all the way to the 1950s. and look at the works of linguists. So we're going to dive a little bit into linguistics, not too deeply. You know, I don't have a background in linguistics, but just, you know, enough to understand where word embeddings come from. So we're going to talk about distributional hypothesis. That's a hypothesis that was introduced back in 1952 or 54, 1954 actually. So it's been around for a while. Linguistic researchers kind of agreed that this distributional hypothesis is an important contribution to linguistics. So let's look at what this hypothesis states. Words that occur in the same context are typically similar. Words that we use in the same context, chances are they're semantically similar. Consider the following sentences. It's quite humid today. It will be quite dry tomorrow. So I have two sentences. According to the distributional hypothesis, humid and dry are probably similar. Why would they be similar? Well, let's look at the context. They both occur in the same context between the word quite and another word describing the day, today, tomorrow, right? So they have a similar context. And so chances are they're semantically related. The words tomorrow and today are probably similar since they appear after a word describing humidity. So maybe they are related to time. So they have a semantic relationship. Obviously, you would not conclude these things from only two sentences. You would conclude these things from millions of sentences. So I'm trying to make conclusions from two sentences, and that really doesn't make sense. But this is just to illustrate what the distributional hypothesis is. So words that appear in a similar context are probably semantically related. Okay. So let's see how we're going to use this distributional hypothesis in order to create word embeddings. So the goal is to create these vectors that capture semantic information about the words. So let's suppose that context of a word W corresponds to two words, the word that comes before W and the word that comes after W. So the context of the word W corresponds to the word that comes before it and the word that comes after it. So if we consider the following corpus, and corpus is basically the body of text that you have in order to generate the vectors. If we have the corpus that is the smallest corpus in the world, I'm happy to see you, I'm glad to see you too, just two sentences. Typically your corpus would be millions of sentences in order to be able to extract anything meaningful. But let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's assume you have this tiny corpus, just two sentences. We can vectorize each word by specifying the number of times it occurs in a particular context. So let me show you how. So what I've done here is I defined every possible context. Remember, context of a word refers to the word before it and the word that comes after it. So I will define all pairs of words that come before and after a word. And that's what I've done in my columns. So for instance, I, the word I, comes between nothing, the beginning of the sentence, and the word am. And so nothing and am is one possible context. Oops. Let's look at happy, for instance. Happy comes between am and to, and so am and to, that's one context. And so we gather all the possible contexts that we can extract from this corpus, and so we put them as our columns. Okay, so we have all these contexts, and then we look at all the words that we have. For instance, the word I. The word I appears in the context nothing and am twice, right? It appears here once and here once, so it appears twice, right? So in the context of nothing and am, it appears twice because it appears here preceded by nothing and followed by am, and it appears here preceded by nothing followed by am. The word, let's say, happy, appears in the context of am and to once. So we have this context M and 2, it appears once. Okay, so we look at all these possible contexts and we count the number of times these words appear in this particular context. And so what I've done here is I've generated a vector associated with each word. The vector for I is 2, 0, 0, 0, 0, and so forth. The vector of M is 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. But obviously, you know, I'm using this silly, simple corpus. Imagine you have millions of sentences, then you would come up with a more meaningful table. And so even with this silly example, you can start seeing that the vector for happy and glad is identical because they kind of appear in similar contexts. So you have identical 0, 0, 1 followed by all zeros, 0, 0, 1 followed by all zeros. In reality, if you have a large enough corpus, you're not going to end up with the same exact vector for happy and glad, but these vectors would be similar so that the distance between happy and glad would be small, because happy and glad, they are kind of used interchangeably, so they appear in similar contexts, and therefore they would have a similar vector. Any questions about that?
Yes, Professor.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to ask about the features. For example, you have features such M and I happy and M2 as well as happy C. So how could you determine these features? I think the pattern is that every 2 words. Is that right?
Yeah, so basically in this case, when you're dealing with word embeddings, each word corresponds to a vector, right? And so if I want to make sense of the sentiment in I am happy to see you, I would convert each word in this sentence into a vector. And so I get a set of vectors. And that set of vectors is what I feed into my machine learning algorithm. So machine learning algorithm will deal better with just a set of vectors as opposed to feeding, you know, words, because it doesn't really deal with words. So I'm feeding it a set of vectors, and these vectors have semantic information. And so hopefully if I train it enough on set of vectors, then it starts to recognize when I see these kind of vectors, these correspond to particular sentiment or particular emotions.
Yeah, I got it. All of that are vectors, are tables. You got the data set. My question is that how do you know you could extract the features in this way, such as you choose I happy as a feature as the second column? So
Why do I have I happy?
Yeah, why?
Okay, because in this example, what we said, and this is not the only way of doing this, but that's one way, we said we're going to assume that context refers to, for context of a word W refers to the word that comes before W and the word that comes after W. And so if
Yes.
So let's say I have a word, let's say W is happy, okay?
Okay.
The word that comes before happy is am. The word that
And
comes
2.
after happy is 2. So am and 2, that's one possible context. So I put it in as a column. So I look at all the possible context. Each one of them, I put it in a column.
Okay, I got it. So the left column, the column on the left is that words that word W, is that right? For example, M is the second W for unhappy.
Oh no, okay, this one because if you look at the word I,
yes,
nothing comes before it and am comes after it. So this context is nothing and am. That's why nothing. That's why we have it just am.
Okay, so you determine the column according to the rows, right? Because the row is every word, and you can judge that every word in the column is as the word W. Could you get what I mean?
How I determine it is in this example, or how it's practically determined. In this example, I just extracted every possible context. That means every possible pair of before and after word.
Okay.
In reality, that might give you a huge set, a very large set. So what you would do is you would look at linguistics and look at popular contexts that kind of tend to repeat in language, and these are the contexts that you are more interested in, as opposed to looking at every possible pair of words in the language. You look at contexts that tend to repeat quite frequently, and these would be your columns.
Okay, okay, I got it. So how will you teach us how to determine the cleaning, the more cleaning data, the more cleaning features?
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay.
mention how you further clean,
Okay, thank you.
this table.
Okay.
So that's the next slide. So we got this table. I hope it's kind of clear how we got this table. So in our example, we have 12 different contexts from a very tiny corpus. But if you have a really realistic corpus, then you will end up with millions of possible columns. But also, as you've seen in the example, a lot of the dimensions here, a lot of these columns carry very little information. Look at these two. All zeros. So some of them just have very little information. So in reality, when you have these millions of columns, some of them are really not that useful. So the first thing you do is you try to get rid of as many of these columns as possible. One way to do it is just delete these columns because you assess these are not important columns. Another way is to combine multiple columns together. Maybe I have 5 columns, they all carry little information. Maybe I can just combine them, add their values together into one column. So that will allow you to reduce the number of columns. Then you apply a second technique called dimensionality reduction. There are many dimensionality reduction techniques. I'm not going to go over them. But the idea of dimensionality reduction techniques is that you're looking at columns that are highly correlated. If they're highly correlated, they're kind of telling me the same thing. There's redundancy in the information. I can remove one of them and keep the other. And so you keep doing that until you end up with a manageable number of dimensions in your vector, maybe 300 or less than 300. And so you end up describing each word semantically using a vector of 300 dimensions. And so that's a kind of in a nutshell how you would go about constructing word embeddings for your text. Now here's the good news. Unless you want to specialize in this area, want to do research in word embeddings, you don't really have to know a lot beyond that, because researchers in this area have been working very hard to develop algorithms and libraries that allow you to extract word embeddings from text. So you have Google has been very active in this area. They produced their word embedding called Word2Vec. It's the most popular one, and it works quite well. And there are others that have been also proposed. And so unless you're going to do research on word embeddings in particular, you don't really have to understand beyond that. Just understand how kind of it works, know the intuition behind it, and so you can immediately start using word embeddings in your project. Okay, so speech intonation. I'm thinking maybe we can start with speech intonation next week. Unless somebody wants me to continue, I can keep going. I can keep talking about this stuff forever. So you guys will let me know. If somebody wants me to continue, let me know. If I don't see anything, maybe because you're tired. I can't see your faces. Normally in class, I would assess based on your facial expressions. I have only one student that I can see. So.
Perfect.
So you guys tell me if you'd like me to continue, I keep going. If nobody asks me to continue, then we'll call it a night, and we'll continue next week. If I don't hear from anybody in the chat, then it'll be it for today. Okay, so I wish you a wonderful weekend. Please make sure to fill the list of students looking for a group if you don't have a group yet, and I'll be assigning you a group. Don't forget, assignment 2 is apparently due next week. I'm going to clarify the due date on Brightspace, make it clear it's due September 25th, and also change the due date on Turnitin so you can submit your assignment. You have until September 25th to submit your assignment. And also, once you set up your team, start immediately looking at assignment 2. Yeah, can we talk? Yes. Oh, that's perfect. Okay, perfect. So thank you, everyone. If you have a question for me, now is a good time to ask. If not, that will be it for tonight. Any questions? Okay, thank you. I'll see you next week.